Late winter, 1944. Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge rages in the background. The air is cold, heavy with the scent of wet earth and gunpowder. In a makeshift POW camp, German soldiers stand in a row, their breath misting in the frozen air. They eye the U.S. field rations handed to them with incredulity. Small cans, cardboard boxes, and tightly sealed packets. Laughter ripples through the group. The food looks nothing like the hearty, familiar meals they've known. One prisoner cracks a joke, something about how this is no feast fit for a soldier. The others chuckle, shaking their heads. The C-rations and K-rations are nothing special, just emergency sustenance, right? But then, they open the cans. A slotted spoon stirs the contents. Canned ham, crackers, peaches, and a cup of instant coffee. The skepticism fades. The first man takes a bite. His eyes widen. It's not bad. In fact, it's surprisingly good. And then, the transformation begins, not just in their taste buds, but in their understanding. The food, so humble, so unexpected, becomes a bridge between enemy lines and shared humanity. The winter of 1944 marked a critical moment in World War II. For Germany, it was a time of retreat as the Allies pressed forward on all fronts. The Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive in the West, had been launched just weeks earlier. The bitter cold, the snow, and the exhaustion weighed heavily on all sides. But the Allied forces, especially the Americans, continued to push toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The Ardennes would soon give way to the full might of the U.S. Army's logistical network. But before that, a crucial piece of the puzzle, sustenance, played an essential role. The German military was in dire straits. Food shortages had become rampant within their ranks, as the Nazi war machine was stretched thin, trying to supply troops scattered across Europe. Soldiers rarely saw fresh food, living instead on meager rations, stale bread, canned meat, and powdered substitutes. As the war dragged on, their rations became increasingly bland and unappetizing. The soldiers had learned to endure hunger, to accept food as fuel rather than comfort. On the other side, the U.S. Army had developed an entirely different approach to ration. The C-ration and K-ration were designed not just for sustenance, but for speed, portability, and survival. These rations were an innovation in themselves, engineered to be carried by soldiers in combat, to withstand the conditions of war, and to provide enough calories for the grueling days of combat. Each soldier was given these rations to keep them moving, to keep them alive. The C-rations contained a full meal, canned meats, crackers, fruit, and sometimes even cigarettes. The K-rations, originally created for airmen, were smaller but included 3 meals a day, packed into small boxes designed for easy transport. The German soldiers, now captured and detained, had heard whispers of the American rations, described by some as inedible, dull, and inferior to the food they were accustomed to back home. Propaganda had played a role in shaping their perceptions, with their leadership ridiculing the food supply of their enemies, claiming that the Allies were so overwhelmed by logistical issues that their food was nothing more than survival paste. When the German prisoners were first handed the American field rations, many laughed. The boxes, the tin cans, the strange combinations of foods, none of it looked appetizing, let alone filling. They were used to well-seasoned meals, thick stews, potatoes, and fresh bread. In contrast, the U.S. rations appeared to be nothing more than emergency supplies, but hunger soon forced them to open the can, to try the meals they'd previously mocked. They had no choice. The war had stripped away everything but the need to survive. As the German prisoners cracked open the cans and examined their contents, they quickly realized they had been wrong about the rations. It wasn't just the taste, it was the calories. The U.S. rations were carefully designed to provide enough energy for an army that would never be stationary for long. As the German soldiers tasted the canned ham, crackers, and even the instant coffee, their initial mockery began to fade. The food was unpretentious, but effective. It sustained them. It filled the belly, and it filled them with a reluctant respect for the ingenuity of the Americans. The transformation in their attitude was subtle at first. What had started as laughter, mocking their captors' provisions, slowly turned into surprise. There were murmurs of appreciation. Some even expressed that the American food wasn't as bad as they had expected. It wasn't the rich meals of home, but it had a strange comfort of its own, something they hadn't expected from an enemy they'd been taught to hate. As they sat down and ate, their perceptions of their enemy began to shift. The U.S. rations weren't just survival meals, they were a testament to American resourcefulness and logistical efficiency. It became clear the Allied powers were not only capable of waging war on a massive scale, they were also capable of feeding their forces with a level of precision that left their enemies in awe. The irony wasn't lost on the prisoners. They had come to expect American food to be inadequate, but now it was their own rations that seemed lacking in comparison. By the time the German soldiers tasted their first American C-rations, they were already well acquainted with the grim realities of war. For months, the Wehrmacht had fought a losing battle on multiple fronts, from the vast Russian steppes to the muddy fields of France, and now in the freezing winter of the Ardennes. The German army was exhausted, and food supplies were dwindling. Their rations had become scanty and unappetizing, often consisting of poor-quality bread, ersatz coffee substitutes, and meat products that were little more than mystery paste. The German soldiers had long learned to make do with what they had, scavenging when they could, and surviving on barely sufficient meals. Nutrition became a secondary concern. The focus was simply to endure. The stomach pains, the lightheadedness, and the constant hunger were nothing new. But it wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. The civilian population in Germany was also grappling with severe food shortages. The Third Reich's extensive rationing system had collapsed under the weight of war, and even the elite Wehrmacht was no exception. By contrast, the U.S. military had developed a logistical system that could deliver rations quickly and efficiently to soldiers on the move. The C-ration was created for quick, mobile consumption in the field, designed to keep soldiers healthy, energized, and functional under extreme combat conditions. By 1944, the C-ration contained a balanced mix of proteins, carbohydrates, and vitamins, often supplemented with candy bars, fruit, and even instant coffee, a luxury on the front line. The K-ration was an even more compact version, intended for soldiers who needed a high-calorie, portable meal during air missions or amphibious landing. Despite their compactness, these rations were designed to keep soldiers well-fed and in top condition for long periods. The contents might include meat and vegetables, crackers, instant coffee, and a dessert, all packed neatly in a box designed to fit easily into a soldier's pack. Though far from gourmet, the U.S. rations were practical, providing enough fuel for the soldiers to march, fight, and survive. The German prisoners, when initially handed the U.S. rations, were skeptical. The American food culture was foreign to them. They had grown up with hearty meals centered on meat and potatoes, and their concept of what constituted a proper meal was rooted in their own agricultural traditions. The American C-rations, in contrast, were small, compact, and unfamiliar. The food's appearance didn't help. The small cans and paper packets looked far from appetizing, and the prisoners immediately expressed their disdain. Some even joked, "Is this what they feed the animals?" The cans appeared thin and pale, and they assumed the food inside would be bland, tasteless, and unworthy of even a soldier's stomach. To them, it seemed like another one of the countless rationing gimmicks that had swept through the wartime economies of the world. But as they dug into the C-rations, a surprising shift occurred. Their initial mockery and disdain quickly turned to surprise. The canned ham, for example, though not exactly a gourmet dish, was unexpectedly tender and flavorful. The crackers, dry as they were, still tasted better than the stale bread they'd been eating for weeks. The fruit, once a rarity in German rations, was refreshing and oddly satisfying. Even the instant coffee, which they had mocked most of all, was rich and strong, something they hadn't expected from a packet of powder. The most noticeable difference was the caloric value. In contrast to their own meager rations, the American C-rations were packed with calories, the kind of energy needed to march for hours, fight in brutal conditions, or endure cold nights without proper shelter. They were designed to fuel the soldier, to keep them functioning on the battlefield. For the Germans, it was a taste of something they hadn't experienced in months, food that was not only filling but comforting. Soon, the prisoners stopped laughing. Instead, there were murmurs of approval, of surprised admiration. It wasn't the rich stews or fresh bread of their homeland, but it was a meal that didn't merely keep them alive, it kept them strong. The simple, functional nature of the American rations became clear. They were designed not just to sustain life, but to preserve the fighting spirit of the soldier. For the German prisoners, this was a sobering realization. The Americans had not only mastered the art of war on the battlefield, but they had also perfected the art of survival. The rations were part of a larger system of efficiency and innovation, one that was turning the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. For the German prisoners, the first bite of American rations wasn't just a physical act. It was a moment of profound realization. The laughter that initially filled the air as they mocked the unfamiliar food quickly turned into silence. As the canned ham was passed around, a few hesitated. They were used to the taste of preserved meats, but this was different, tender, flavorful, and surprisingly rich. Some prisoners, whose faces had been drawn with exhaustion, now looked up at one another with an unspoken acknowledgement. They had been taught that the Allied soldiers were not only enemies, but also inferior in many ways. The idea that the Americans, who had long been depicted as uncultured and unrefined, could produce such food was both humbling and surprising. What was most striking, however, was not just the taste of the food, but the practicality behind it. Each component, though simple, was well-balanced, designed to fuel the soldiers for long, grueling days. For many of the prisoners, this was a moment of internal conflict. They had been trained to believe that the American enemy was somehow less than their own forces, weaker, softer, less capable. Yet here they sat, eating from cans and packets, and they couldn't deny the simple truth. The food they were eating was effective and sustaining. The shift in perception wasn't immediate, but it began to take root. The mockery of their captors' rations gave way to a reluctant admiration. One prisoner, who had initially laughed at the thought of canned ham, now took a second helping, his face softening as he tasted the sweetness of the fruit preserved in syrup. This experience would stick with them long after the war. In later years, some of these prisoners would recall this moment as one of the unexpected turning points of their captivity. It wasn't just the food that changed their view of the Americans, but the realization that even in the darkest days of war, there was still humanity in the way the U.S. treated their captives, even if it was through something as simple as a can of ham. The success of U.S. food logistics was not just about feeding the soldier. It was about maintaining combat effectiveness. For an army on the move, food was more than just a source of energy. It was a crucial tool that determined how quickly they could operate, how well they could sustain themselves, and, ultimately, how quickly they could win. The German prisoners who ate the rations soon realized the difference between their own meager meals and the U.S. rations. The C-rations were designed to meet the needs of the modern soldier, high-calorie, compact and nutritious. The German soldiers, by contrast, had faced severe shortages for months. Their rations were horribly inadequate, consisting of poorly preserved bread, meat substitutes, and sometimes nothing more than flour or mystery paste. Even their coffee was a substitute, often flavored with grains or barley, nothing like the strong coffee the Americans carried in their rations. In a war where movement was the key to success, the ability to sustain soldiers on the move was vital. American logistics networks were nothing short of a marvel in this regard. C-rations and K-rations were designed to be lightweight, easy to carry, and incredibly practical. The soldiers could eat on the move, without the need to set up full-scale kitchens or wait for hot meals. The food could be eaten immediately, without any preparation, allowing for speed and efficiency on the battlefield. For the Germans, this was an eye-opening experience. They were used to food that was heavy, bland, and slow to prepare. The notion that food could be both compact and nutritious, designed to sustain an entire army while allowing them to stay on the move, was something that they hadn't fully appreciated. The American system, although simple, was strategically superior in its effectiveness. In captivity, when the Germans tasted the U.S. rations, they came to realize that what they had once dismissed as cheap and inadequate was actually a system that had been designed with military, mobility, and efficiency in mind. The German soldiers' realization was tactical as much as it was personal. The U.S. rations were a testament to the strategic thinking behind the American war effort. The ability to feed an army that could advance rapidly across Europe, even with a shattered supply line, was a testament to American ingenuity and industrial power. In their prison camps, the German soldiers sat in awe of the fact that their enemies had managed not only to defeat them militarily, but also to ensure that their forces remained sustained and effective despite the chaos of war. The ingenuity of U.S. rations didn't just lie in their taste or calories, it was in their design and production. The American military had worked tirelessly to create field rations that could support soldiers without needing complicated food preparation. The result was C-rations and K-rations, which had been adapted throughout the war based on evolving needs and technological advances in food preservation. The key to the C-rations' success lay in its simplicity and portability. Each ration pack was compact, waterproof, and durable, crucial for soldiers operating in rain-soaked trenches, snow-covered forests, and desert landscapes. The canned meals were designed to withstand the elements, providing nutrition that could last for weeks without spoiling. This was an achievement made possible through innovative packaging techniques, such as the use of tin cans, which were both cheap and effective at preserving food. The K-ration was an even more advanced solution, especially designed for soldiers on the move. Packed in small cardboard boxes, these rations were intended for soldiers who couldn't stop for long meals, airmen, paratroopers, and others who needed something lightweight yet sustaining. Each K-ration contained 3 meals: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, along with instant coffee, candy bars, and biscuits, all packed in a neat, compact box. The idea was to give the soldier everything they needed without the weight or bulk of traditional meals. For the German prisoners, this was a striking difference. They had often carried large, cumbersome food supplies that were difficult to store and impossible to carry long distances. The fact that American soldiers could simply grab their rations, tear open a can, and begin eating within minutes was a testament to the superior logistics that the Allies had perfected. The American system was a technological marvel, made possible by the coordination of the food industry, military engineers, and supply chains. The rations had been designed not only for taste, but for practical application in combat, ensuring that the food soldiers ate didn't hinder their ability to fight. For the German prisoners, the sheer simplicity of the system, the efficiency with which food was packed, delivered, and consumed, was a revelation. They were seeing firsthand the American ability to organize and execute plans on a massive scale. It was an ordinary moment in the extraordinary world of war. Yet it marked the beginning of a transformation for the German prisoners. The laughter had subsided, and silence settled over the group. The mockery of the U.S. rations had turned to curiosity, then disbelief. With every bite, the prisoners found themselves increasingly surprised at the taste, texture, and caloric richness of the food. Canned ham, crackers, and fruit seemed almost decadent compared to the meager rations they had been living on for months. The initial resistance to the food, the laughter at its unappetizing appearance, gradually gave way to murmurs of approval, and then reluctant recognition. One of the prisoners, a young soldier, had been skeptical at first. He had been raised on the hearty meals of his homeland: sausage, potato stews, and fresh bread. This ration, though practical, was nothing like the meals he had been accustomed to. But as he bit into the canned fruit and tasted its sweetness, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossed his face. The instant coffee was another revelation. He had laughed when it was first handed to him. He expected it to be little more than a bitter, watered-down concoction. But the rich, strong taste was a comforting surprise. He could feel the warmth of the beverage spread through him as he drank, a small but meaningful luxury that was both familiar and alien. His mind drifted from the immediate hardship of war to the comforts of home, a place that, at that moment, seemed impossibly distant. One by one, the German prisoners began to set aside their mockery. Their pride in their homeland, their army, their superior rations, all seemed distant and insignificant now. There was an uneasy camaraderie forming as they shared their thoughts, their impressions of the food, and the strange, unexpected warmth it gave them. The simple act of eating, once a mundane task, became a shared experience that united them, if only for a few minutes, across enemy lines. In the cold, muddy prison camp, as snowflakes gently fell outside, something had shifted. The rations were not just food anymore. They had become a reflection of the American military machine, efficient, organized, and unyielding. This was no longer just about food. It was about understanding the power of the enemy, how their enemies could not only wage war, but sustain themselves in ways that the Germans had not anticipated. But it wasn't just the food that caught the prisoners off guard. It was the realization that survival, at least for now, was possible because of the Allied logistics system. The rations were not a mark of luxury, but of a war-fighting strategy that emphasized mobility, sustainability, and efficiency. The Germans had long believed that starvation, deprivation, and privation were tools of war, ways to break their enemy's spirit. Instead, they were faced with the fact that the Americans had created a system that not only fed their soldiers, but kept them at peak combat effectiveness. For these German soldiers, this was a powerful moment. They had laughed at their captors, but now they found themselves respecting them, if not for their ideology or their military prowess, then for the practical, grounded effectiveness they had brought to the battlefield. The humility that crept in was hard to ignore. How could they have thought their enemies incapable of such innovation? This small, seemingly insignificant moment of eating was the beginning of a much larger shift in how the German prisoners would perceive their American captors. They had been taught that the enemy was inferior, but in this moment, food became the most humbling of teachers. The prisoners were not only facing their captors, but confronting the idea that perhaps they had undervalued their opponents all along. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. As the last remnants of the C-rations were finished, the German prisoners sat back, not with the dismissive attitudes they had carried into the camp, but with a sense of quiet reflection. They looked at their empty cans, the remaining scraps of fruit, the slightly crumpled crackers that had once seemed so unappetizing. The food, which had sparked so much mockery, had now become the subject of discussions among the prisoners. They started sharing more than just their experiences of battle. They discussed the American ration, how the food had been unexpectedly filling, comforting, and, above all, effective. The skepticism had turned into reluctant respect. One prisoner, who had initially been the loudest in mocking the U.S. provisions, sat quietly, his hands wrapped around the empty can of fruit cocktail. He looked at his comrades and said, with quiet sincerity, "I never thought I would say it, but this is better than what we've been getting for months." The others nodded in agreement, some even offering their own remarks on how the rations had been surprisingly substantial and tasty. The shock wasn't just about the taste. It was the realization that the Americans had designed their food system to sustain soldiers in ways the Germans could never have imagined. The very nature of the food reflected the American ethos, practical, adaptable, and robust. In comparison, their own rations seemed not just inadequate but inefficient. The German army, under Nazi leadership, had believed that deprivation was part of the struggle, that soldiers could push through hunger as a badge of honor. Yet here they were, surrounded by an enemy whose ingenuity had found a way to keep their forces fighting strong, day after day. Without the physical toll of starvation, the American rations weren't just a tactical advantage. They were a demonstration of modern military thinking. The U.S. had adopted the idea that sustainability, nutrition, and morale were as important as the bullets they fired and the tanks they drove. Every piece of food served in the C-rations was carefully designed to help soldiers endure and perform, whether in the heat of the Pacific Islands or the frozen Ardennes. This was logistics as warfare, a field where the Americans had outpaced the Germans by miles. For the prisoners, there was an unexpected reversal of pride. They had once thought of themselves as the superior soldiers, trained and disciplined in the traditions of the Wehrmacht. But now, with each bite of U.S. food, they began to realize something fundamental. The Americans were not just surviving. They were thriving in a way that Germany's war effort could not match. It wasn't just about food. It was about strategy. The American military had managed to create an ecosystem of efficiency in which food, equipment, and men all moved in perfect synchrony. The German war machine, by contrast, had become weighed down by its own inefficiency, struggling to feed its soldiers while maintaining the necessary strength for battle. By the end of the meal, the prisoners' perspective had been completely altered. They had moved from mockery to admiration, not just for the American soldiers, but for the system that sustained them. It was clear now that the war was not just being fought on the front lines, it was being won in the supply line, in the simple act of ensuring that every soldier had the food, tools, and resources they needed to continue the fight. A quiet respect had formed among the prisoners. They had laughed at their captors, but now, sitting around the fire with empty C-ration cans, they couldn't deny that America's approach to war was one they hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't just about beating the enemy. It was about outlasting them, outsmarting them in ways that went beyond the battlefield. For the German soldiers, the war had shifted once more. They hadn't just lost a battle, they had lost the mindset that allowed them to even compete with the Allies. And in that moment, food, of all things, had taught them that victory was not simply a matter of firepower. It was a matter of sustaining the fight for as long as it took to win. When the fighting finally subsided, the German prisoners were left with more than just a full belly. They were left with an unsettling realization. The Americans had not only outfought them, but outthought them. The simple act of feeding their soldiers had become a symbol of Allied superiority, something that continued to linger in the minds of the prisoners long after the war ended. The U.S. rations, once mocked for their modest packaging and plain contents, had become a silent weapon of psychological warfare. They weren't just about keeping soldiers alive. They were about keeping them strong, energized, and efficient, enabling them to fight, move, and win with a level of coordination that German forces simply couldn't match. For the prisoners, the experience of eating these rations marked a stark contrast to their own rationing system, which had suffered from shortages and poor quality. The food the Americans provided, though far from extravagant, was effective and nutritious, designed for sustenance rather than ceremony. This realization left a deep impact on many of the prisoners. Years after the war, when the former soldiers looked back, they remembered the unexpected surprise of the U.S. field rations. They recalled the initial skepticism and mockery, followed by the slow, almost embarrassed acknowledgement that the American system had provided them with a level of care they hadn't expected. One German soldier later wrote in his memoir, "We were taught to endure deprivation, but we never thought our enemy could sustain themselves so well." This sentiment was echoed across multiple prisoner reports and post-war accounts. Many former German soldiers admitted to respecting the Allies more after their experience with the food ration, recognizing that what had initially seemed like an afterthought, tinned meat and canned fruits, had actually played a key role in maintaining the fighting spirit of the U.S. forces. For the Allied forces, the realization that their rations had such an impact was never openly acknowledged, but it had its effect. Logistics were not as glorified as battlefield triumphs, yet the American military's ability to maintain morale and fighting capability through efficient supply chains became a cornerstone of their success. The engineers who designed the food rations, as much as the soldiers who fought with them, played a crucial role in the victory. Meanwhile, German command could no longer ignore the logistical failure that had plagued their own forces. In addition to their supply problems, the German military's strategic mistakes and lack of efficient food delivery had taken a severe toll on their soldiers' health and morale. The American rations were not just food. They were a symbol of an approach to warfare that was both practical and sustaining. In contrast, the German military relied on outdated and inefficient systems, unable to match the speed and mobility of the Allied logistics network. The German soldiers, now in captivity, could not help but acknowledge that even in a time of total war, the Americans' food logistics were a force to be reckoned with. In the following weeks, as the prisoners of war settled into their camps, the subject of food became a regular topic of conversation. What had once been a source of ridicule became the point of a strange sort of respect. The Americans, in their simplicity, had built a system that outlasted the Germans in ways they had never anticipated. The war was still far from over, but in this one small moment, the Germans saw something that they had failed to see for years. A new kind of strength that didn't come from the barrel of a gun, but from the practical resources that sustained an army long after the initial engagement. The impact of U.S. rations on the German prisoners continued to resonate long after the war ended. For many of them, their time in captivity was not just a moment of personal reflection, but also an opportunity to witness the incredible logistical advantage the Allied forces had established. The difference in sustenance and supply chains had been a defining factor in the war's final years, and the prisoners were now seeing firsthand how the Americans had built an unassailable infrastructure that allowed them to sustain their armies in ways that Germany could never replicate. As 1945 drew to a close and the war ended, many former German soldiers, in interviews and post-war memoirs, would reflect on the impact of American food logistics. Their perception of the Allies had shifted dramatically. What had once been an abstract concept, the idea of American efficiency, was now something personal. U.S. rations had become a symbol of their enemy's resourcefulness and pragmatic approach to war. These meals, once scorned, had become a reminder that success on the battlefield wasn't just about bravery or firepower, it was also about the sustainability of a force and the ability to maintain operational capability over long periods of time. For many of the former prisoners, this was a sobering realization. They had underestimated their captors, not just in terms of military strategy, but in terms of how effectively the Americans could maintain the morale and fighting spirit of their soldiers, even in the most difficult of conditions. The German soldiers had been brought up on a sense of pride in their own military's ability to endure and survive. But the American approach, with its focus on practicality and efficiency, was something that the Germans had not fully appreciated until they had to face it. In post-war Europe, as the German economy began to rebuild, many former soldiers went into engineering, logistics, or other fields that dealt with the efficient movement of goods. Their experiences with the U.S. ration system influenced their thinking. Many of them would later admit that the American success in this area was a major factor in Germany's post-war recovery. The efficiency of the Allied supply chains, combined with the ingenuity of American logistics, was something that German engineers and logisticians would strive to replicate in the years to come. The Bailey bridges, the floating pontoons, and, of course, the food rations all became part of the larger American approach to modern warfare, a model that would be studied and, in some cases, emulated in the rebuilding of Europe. For the Allied forces, the rations weren't just about feeding the soldiers. They were about ensuring the long-term success of the war effort. The ability to maintain a fighting force in the field, even after months of fighting, was crucial. The C-rations and K-rations were designed to be practical, portable, and durable, allowing the U.S. Army to remain mobile, flexible, and prepared for whatever came next. For the German prisoners, the irony of the situation wasn't lost on them. What had once been mocked and dismissed became a symbol of American superiority. It wasn't just the taste or the quality of the food. It was the realization that the U.S. system could keep soldiers fighting with sustenance and discipline, while their own military was crumbling under the weight of its inefficiencies. In the chaos and destruction of war, it's often the most unexpected elements that shape outcomes. The story of the German prisoners who mocked the U.S. food rations only to find themselves unexpectedly impressed by them, speaks to a larger truth. In war, it's not always the most obvious tactics that win. Sometimes, it's the simple things that make all the difference. The logistics, the resources, and the ability to sustain an army that determine the course of a conflict. The irony of the situation was not lost on the German prisoners. They had fought for years under the assumption that their military superiority was founded on discipline, technology, and efficiency. Yet, in that one simple moment, when they tasted the C-rations, they realized that the Allied forces had outpaced them in the one area that truly mattered for sustaining a prolonged war: the ability to maintain supply chains. The U.S. rations, though humble in appearance, were a manifestation of the American ability to organize, innovate, and adapt. The power of American logistics wasn't in the fancy meals or extravagant supply lines. It was in the small details, in how every soldier was equipped to fight for as long as needed. It was a battle fought not on the front lines, but in warehouses, factories, and military kitchens. It was about ensuring that no soldier was left to fight hungry or weakened by inadequate food. That was the strength that allowed the Americans to push forward relentlessly. Advancing from Normandy to Berlin in the months that followed, the German soldiers Now captives saw this strength in a way they never had before. They had been fighting a losing battle for survival, but they were finally seeing that their enemy's strength lay not only in their firepower, but in their ability to adapt, to sustain, and to outlast. And in that realization lay a key to understanding why the Allies would ultimately win the war, not just through superior weapons, but through an approach that balanced innovation, organization, and humanity. As the war ended, the prisoners were freed, but the lessons they learned from the U.S. rations stayed with them. It was more than a lesson in taste. It was a reminder of how survival, both on the battlefield and in the aftermath of war, is defined not just by what one fights with, but by what one can sustain. In the end, it wasn't just the military might of the Allies that secured victory. It was their ability to keep fighting one meal at a time.